Hi, Rashonda here. We are reading Hagar's Daughter by Pauline Hopkins. It's getting good, y'all. We're on chapter 31. Oh, something I was thinking about. So I didn't mention it while I was reading, but it really struck me that how Venus was described while she was dressed as a boy. It said something about you didn't look like more than a little boy. Let's see. I don't see it now. Oh, here it is. This is from chapter 30. I haven't started our reading of chapter 31 yet. It was well along in August when an old Negro calling himself Uncle William Henry Jackson, accompanied by his grandson Billy, a sprightly lad, scarcely more than a boy, wandered into the village and took possession of one of the dilapidated antebellum huts formerly the homes of slaves. So I didn't mention it, but it really struck me that Venus is a grown woman. She's a young woman, but a grown woman nevertheless. And she's dressed up as a boy, Billy, a sprightly lad, scarcely more than a boy. Women come in all shapes and sizes, all shapes and sizes. And women can, maybe have well-endowed breasts, maybe be really flat, and you can alter your appearance to look like a boy or a male or a gender that's not your assigned gender. Like, there are lots of ways we could talk about this. But it struck me that she looked scarcely more than a boy because if I remember correctly, and I might not be remembering, but Venus had previously been described as having, a young womanly figure. And that's hard to look like scarcely more than a boy. And something I have found in literature from this time is a cross-dressing motif thing happening. A lot of it comes from the minstrel stage. But what I've realized in many novels, and I think at one point I mentioned several novels that have kind of this weird dressing thing. And I think I mentioned Our Nig, and I actually don't remember that happened in Our Nig. I might have said that in error. But anyway, part of the point to have a woman dress as a man or as a boy was because they still looked like a woman. It was clear that it was a woman who was dressed up and in disguise. So I'm just wondering if that's what's going on here. So anyway, I was struck by that. And now chapter 31. By the middle of September, Washington awoke from the stagnation incident to the summer vacation and was ready to begin the business of another working year. The departments were reopened and hundreds of stragglers returned to work in the great government hives, all eager for the excitement of the great murder trial. Sunday, the day before the opening of the trial, Cuthbert Sumner sat in his cell looking pale and careworn, but still preserving his outward composure though racked by inward torture. Oh, excuse me. Jules' abduction had been a worse blow to him than his own arrest, and uncertainty as to her fate had nearly driven him wild. But today, hope had smiled her April smile from amid the clouds that threatened, and he was at peace. His lawyer had just left him, bidding him to be of good cheer, for all things pointed to a happy ending of his troubles. Absorbed in thought, he sat dreaming of the future and planning for a period of felicity that should atone for the suffering of the present time. Suddenly, the key grated in the lock and the door swung open to admit a visitor. He recoiled as from a blow when he met the gaze of Aurelia Madison, who stood staring at him with a glance in which curiosity, fear, and love were mingled. She stood in the center of the gloomy cell like a statue, her dazzling beauty as marvelous as ever, the red gold hair still shining in sunny radiance, the velvet eyes resting upon the man before her with a hidden caress in their liquid depths. My. Sumner shuddered as he gazed and remembered the dead girl's story. When alone with this woman, she had always possessed an irresistible attraction for him, and in spite of the past, the old sensation returned in full force at this unexpected encounter, mingled with fear and repulsion. She broke the spell which held them silent. Bert, my Bert! She stretched out her hand to him, but he made no move to take it. The blood flushed her cheek. Why will you not take my hand? She moved a step nearer to him, but he rose to his feet and drew back. With a passionate cry, she fell on her knees before him, seized his hand, and covered it with kisses. Do not repulse me. See me at your feet. Bert, let me save you. Do not spurn me, I beseech you. Save me? Miss Madison? You jest, replied Sumner in a voice made quiet by a strong effort. I do not jest. I can and will save you. I mean, what is she up to? What is she up to? Her eyes were fixed upon his face in eager intensity. With a shock of surprise, Sumner was convinced that she spoke the truth, but he stood there looking down upon her with all the coolness and sternness of a judge. You tell me news, he said at length. Great God, do not doubt me now. I can save you. All I ask in return is that you take me to your heart again as your affianced wife, and I shall be content. Ah, I thought so. There is a price attached to your generosity. Do not be so merciless. If you only knew. I do know, broke from Sumner's lips as he flung her off. She reeled back, gasping for breath. Still upon her knees, she gazed up into his immovable countenance. For a full minute, there was dead silence. Then Sumner spoke. Do not let us have any more mistakes. If my acquittal depends upon the plan you have mentioned, Miss Madison, I shall never be free. Why do you speak thus? She asked as she rose to her feet. For many reasons, he replied significantly. The woman looked utterly despondent. There was a pause, an exciting pause. Surely, she said at length, you can have no hope that Jewel will return to you. Even if you were free, General Benson will hold her to her promise. Do not speak her name, cried Sumner fiercely. It is sacrilege for your perjured lips to name her whom you have so tricked, deceived, and abused. A bad promise is better broken than kept, and my wife, formerly Miss Jewel Bowen, felt the truth of the old adage when she consented to marry me in this very cell. He could not repress the note of triumph in his voice as he uttered the words, but he was not prepared for what followed. No, she cried out with a passion terrible to see. You have not dared. You could not dare. Stop, said Sumner sternly. I warn you, do not try me too far. You will act wisely if you drop this whole matter and leave Washington and the society where you have queened it so long under false pretenses, for solitude and seclusion where you may escape the scorn of the world. What do you mean? She demanded, her features pale to the very lips. She stood at bay, but in her face it could be seen that she measured his strength, struggling with a new and horrible dread. God forbid that I should make you a social outcast, he replied. Need I speak plainer? Aurelia listened to him with the watchfulness of a tiger who sees the hunter approaching. Her strong, active brain was on the alert, but now her savage nature broke forth. She laughed aloud ferociously and then began a tirade of abuse that would have honored the slums. My, a tirade of abuse that would have honored the slums. I guess she had a potty mouth. And also notice the whole cat reference. She was like a tiger. She had the watchfulness of a tiger. All right. Weary of the whole proceeding, disgusted with himself and the infatuation that had once enthralled him, he said at last, in desperation, let us end this scene in all relations that have ever existed. If you were as pure as snow, and I loved you as my other self, I would never wed with one of colored blood, an octoroon. Boom, that's a mic drop moment. Wordless, with corpse-like face and gleaming eyes, she faced him unflinchingly. If I had a knife in my hand and could stab you to the heart, I would do it. I know you would. But such weapons as I possess, I will use. I will not fly. I will brave you to the last. If the world is to condemn me as the descendant of a race that I abhor, it shall never condemn me as a coward. That's another mic drop moment. Boom, we're getting all the things here. Terrible though her sins might be, terrible her nature, she was but another type of the products of the accursed system of slavery, a victim of man's inhumanity to man that has made countless millions mourn. There was something, too, that compelled admiration in this resolute standing to her guns with a determination to face the worst that fate might have in store for her. Something of all this Sumner felt, but beyond a certain point his New England philanthropy could not reach. He bowed his head at her words and said, "As you will. I have warned you." She stood at the full of her splendid stature, her eyes gleaming, her ashen lips firmly set. Then she turned from him and gave the signal that brought the warden to let her out. Silently, without a backward look, she passed from the cell, and the prisoner was once more left in solitude. She passed from the cell. Anytime I hear pass or something like that, I think of racial passing. At 9 o'clock that same night, Chief Henson stood near a gas lamp on the platform of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station, glancing through a few lines from his colored agent, placed in his hands by plucky little Venus Johnson that very morning. The latter had gone on to the Bowen mansion to prepare the mistress for an unexpected arrival. Chief Henson was particularly pleased with the ability shown by his colored detectives. Smith, the mail agent, was a Civil War veteran who had left a leg at Honey Hill, and on that account, a grateful government had detailed him for duty on Chief Henson's staff of the Secret Service, and he had helped his chief out of many a difficult position, for which Mr. Henson was not slow nor meager in his acknowledgments. There is a series of romance novels. It's historical fiction. It takes place during the Civil War. I totally don't remember who the author is. Was it Beverly Jenkins? I don't think it was Beverly Jenkins. There are like 3 of them that I read a few of their books right together. At any rate, this series of books, it has like, they're called The League or something like that. And it's about Secret Service people-ish who are spies or agents or whatever during the Civil War. And they're all interconnected. I read most of them. There was one of them that just didn't seem all that interesting to me, so I didn't read it. But aside from the one that didn't seem all that interesting, they were actually very interesting. And it talked about like espionage and agents during the Civil War and different ways different people participated. And there's one family of Scottish people in this series of books, and that really reminded me of the Outlander books by Diana Gabaldon, because I had no idea of the large Scottish population in the States at the time of the Civil War. So I learned about that from Diana Gabaldon's books. And then it came to bear in these other books. So anyway, that was all interesting. If I think of the name of the author or the like name of the lead, because each of the books had a different title. Was it Alyssa Cole? It might have been Alyssa Cole. Anyway, we'll get back to this book, but just reading about Mr. Smith and being the colored detective, and Chief Henson was grateful. So now we'll move on. 5 minutes after the train was in, Chief Henson saw Smith advancing toward him, accompanied by 2 females closely veiled. From out the swarming crowd, the great detective stepped and motioned the man to follow him with one of the females, while he himself led the way with the other to the Bowen carriage outside the depot on the avenue. Having placed the women in the carriage and given the coachman his directions, he and Smith entered a herdic and were driven rapidly to his office, where they remained talking until the first hours of the morning. Meanwhile, Venus had resumed her duties as suddenly as she dropped them. The servants wondered among themselves, but not a comment was made. The news that the faithful girl brought seemed to restore Mrs. Bowen's lost vitality. She insisted on rising and being dressed and received Jewel in her arms at the great entrance doors. Supper was served in Mrs. Bowen's private parlor. Anyone who had entered the room would have been surprised at the kind solicitude and graciousness showed old Aunt Henny, who was an honored guest. Mrs. Bowen's attention was evenly divided between her stepdaughter and the old negress. Venus waited on the company, and for the time all thoughts of caste were forgotten, while the representatives of two races met on the ground of mutual interest and regard. Let's read that again. And for the time, all thoughts of caste were forgotten, while the representatives of two races met on the ground of mutual interest and regard. Let that percolate. Again and again, Venus called upon to repeat the story of her adventures. Yes, Miss Bowen, she said for the 20th time, when I peeked in through that window and saw Miss Jewel and Gran sitting there talking, I was plumb crazy for a minute. Then I climbed down as fast as any squirrel and I made tracks for Mr. Smith and I told him what I'd seen. He says to me, says he, now Venus, how in time am I going to get you into that house? We can't break the windows and get in because they're ironed. Claire, says he, I don't know where I'm at. Well, you know, Miss Bowen, I ain't a bit slow, know 'em. If I do say it, and I just thought hard for a minute, and then it struck me. Says I to him, get a move on Dad there. You and me together must tote him to the house. When we get there, you knock up the old woman and make her let you put Dad in. Keep up all the fuss you can, says I, and in the kick-up, why, I'll sneak in and hide. You be waiting by the front door, and I'll have 'em out in a jiffy. Good, says he. 2 heads is better'n 1 if t'other is a sheep's head. Much obliged for calling me a fool, says I. Welcome, says he. But I take off my hat to you, young lady, I does, and I'm going to give the chief a pointer to get you on the staff, says he. So they didn't know how to get in the house. And Venus was like, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take my drunk dad back to the house. It's going to be a whole skirmish, not skirmish. It's a word from my Diana Gabaldon books. It's something like skirlock, but it means a whole big dust up ado. And in the middle of the ado, Venus is going to sneak in, get the people, sneak out. And Smith was like, you should be one of Chief Henson's people. So that's interesting. Here's something to help the cause along, and he gave me a big bunch of keys and a dark lantern. Try the keys on the big front door, he says. Well, everything worked particularly fine, Miss Bowen. Dad was so drunk he couldn't stand, and he didn't know whether he was afoot or riding. I slipped in all right, got my lady and Gran, and got away as slick as grease. Dad ain't shown his head since. Mr. Henson's looking for him, but I know he'll keep shy. I reckon he don't want to see old General Benson for one right smart spell. He's scared all right, scared to pieces. Aunt Henny said nothing, but once in a while she would nod her turbaned head in seeming perplexity as she furtively watched every movement made by Mrs. Bowen. For her part, Mrs. Bowen seemed uneasy under the old woman's persistent regard. So there's some sort of history between Mrs. Bowen and Aunt Henny, and they are feeling each other out, and Mrs. Bowen is uncomfortable. And that is where we end chapter 31 of Hagar's Daughter by Pauline Hopkins. I'm Rashonda Cade. Until next time.